Well, we're in the middle of the sermon series entitled Kingdom Ethics. A few weeks ago, we looked at, what's the Christian's response to creation. Last week, we looked at what's the Christian's response to the immigrant. And today, we are going to say, how does the follower of Jesus define the value of life? Is that it's important for us to make sure we articulate and understand the ramifications of valuing life. Because what gives life value? A certain level of ability, a certain level of comforts that we can achieve, contributing to society. And when we start talking about those types of things, I fear we have crossed from value to meaning or value to purpose. We all want to have some type of purpose or ways that we can contribute or joy that we can receive. But I don't think that actually is what value is or how we are to value ourselves. Because we can look at the world around us and we can think of extreme case scenarios of maybe someone born with Down syndrome. And no one wants that for themselves or anyone else. And it's a difficult situation to say the least, but does that life have value? We have to define what value is before we can actually say if that life has value, regardless of what we're talking about. Because it's important to recognize that value is derived from the fact that we are created in the image of God. That's value. I'm valuable not because I can do this, that, or the other, or I don't do this, that, or the other. I am valuable because I'm created in the image of God. And so if I recognize my value derives not from what I can or cannot do, it derives from who God is and that fact that God created me, then I recognize that everybody else has value. No matter their ability, no matter how much they do or do not contribute to society, value derives from being created in the image of God. Now, if we take God out of the equation, then there's no morality in the world. If we don't have a higher authority, a higher being, then morals are relative. But we believe in God, the Creator, and that He created me, and that my value derives from there. So that person with Down syndrome has as much value as anybody else in the world. Not because of what the world says, but because of who God is. Now, we do recognize that there's a lot of times many people have some type of discomfort when interacting with someone with extreme disabilities. Again, we'll go back to the Down syndrome scenario. But if we recognize that person has value, regardless if we're interacting with the most normal by societal standards or the most abnormal by societal standards, that person has value, then we can show dignity, we can show respect, and we can see value in that individual. Because Jesus calls us to treat everybody with dignity. He calls us to treat everybody with respect and show value to them, even if it's uncomfortable. But if we confuse value with meaning or value with purpose, then it can make us uncomfortable. It can make us draw conclusions that aren't always the best. It can compromise what Jesus calls us to do. And I want to look at Jesus today of how He shows value to life. And Jesus didn't have just a specific example of this is what the value of life is, but He shows us how we can value life when He interacts with the religious leaders in John chapter 8. And we're going to start in verse 2 of John chapter 8 as Jesus is trying to do His normal life and gets interrupted by the religious leaders. Because starting in verse 2, Jesus is at the temple early in the morning, and a crowd soon gathered, and Jesus sat down and began to teach. As He taught, the religious leaders brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery, and they put her in front of the crowd, and they said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say?" They were trying to trap Him into saying something they could use against Him, but Jesus stooped down and wrote in the dust with His finger. Now, Jesus was doing a normal thing at His time. He was a rabbi and He was teaching. He was teaching in the synagogue, in the temple, at a place where people gathered. It was a normal setting, normal thing for what Jesus would have done in that day. And the religious leaders come and hijacked that time. They brought a woman that was caught in the act of adultery. Now, this was unusual for the religious leaders to do this in this manner. This was not a normal situation. What Jesus was doing by teaching was normal, but the religious leaders' actions were not normal. One, they provided no witness. There was no one to bring testimony that this actually happened. They just presented it as fact. So we have the judge, jury, and executioner situation happening. But the religious leaders were not seeking justice. You don't parade somebody in front of a crowd in order to seek justice. You're doing it to promote your own agenda. And we can see that in the world today, how whether it's politicians, whether it's whoever it is, somebody with influence, uses the crowd to allow their agenda to get further promoted. See, they had no compassion on the woman. Their purpose was to embarrass the woman. The woman was a prop, was a thing to the religious leaders that they could use to further their own objective and agenda. Now, the law is clear that adultery should be punishable by death, that she should be stoned. Now, one thing that I don't want to ignore today is the fact that the religious leaders only brought the woman. The man seemed to be no big deal for the religious leaders. Now we'll talk about gender stuff in a different time, and I don't want to gloss over that, but I just want to point that out today to show how the religious leaders are not acting in good faith. They're not doing what is right. They're not coming to Jesus with sincerity. They are trying to promote their own agenda. They're trying to trap Jesus. Because if Jesus says, well, yeah, that's what the Old Testament law says, we've got to kill her, we've got to stone her, let's do it, let's go, then what would happen is that would break the Roman law. See, Romans gave the Jews a lot of freedom, a lot of authority, a lot of autonomy, but they could not issue the death sentence. They couldn't bring capital punishment on others. That was reserved for Rome and their justice system. And so if Jesus said, yeah, that's what the law says, let's go do it, then that would have broken Roman law. If Jesus would have said, well, Roman law doesn't allow us to do this, then the religious leaders would have used that against him, saying, well, you don't trust in God. You're not faithful to God. You serve the world more than you serve God. So Jesus was in a no-win situation. But when you think about the religious leaders, about what's happening, about the agenda that they have when they come to Jesus, we recognize that they are not playing fair, that they are trying to draw Jesus in to their manufactured drama. We all know people who love to create drama around them. Now, if we're honest, we've all created drama ourselves. Whether we admit it or not, we've done that. But you know one of the most frustrating things to do to somebody who tries to draw you into their drama? It frustrates them to no end when you ignore them, when you don't engage. And so Jesus did not engage because this was not legitimate. It was not sincere. It was trying to trap Jesus. And so he stooped down and he wrote in the dust. And as I think about what's happening here, and I think the religious leaders really show this, people prioritize prosperity, the principle, or the person. I think those are some of the three common categories that we get, either prosperity, the principle, or the person. And the religious leaders were not valuing the person. They did not value this woman. They hid behind the principle of the law so that they could get an advantage, so that they could put Jesus in his place or push him down a little bit. But Jesus calls us to value the person because the person has value, not because of who I am, not because of what they can do, not because of what society says about them, but because they are created in the image of God. Life has value because it is God created and God initiated it in us. And when we talk about life, particularly in the church, this always somehow comes back to the abortion issue. And I think that's part of it. And there are many issues of valuing life that we need to address. We address the disability. Now we're going to look at what about abortion? How does that fit into it? And one of the things when we look at the Bible that's really important to recognize is that every time the Bible talks about the unborn child, it talks about it as though it is a fully fledged human being. That it does not differentiate between the unborn child and the person outside of the womb with the birth certificate or whatever that necessarily looks like. And as Chris read earlier, Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5, I knew you before I formed you in your mother's womb. Before you were born, I set you apart and appointed you as my prophet to the nations. So there's no difference in the mind of God between the unborn and the born, however we want to phrase that. And society, and we'll get to murder here in a minute, but society doesn't allow for murder. I'm not aware of any society that says murder for any reason is okay. And so the issue is, when does this unborn child become a full-fledged human being? That's what we have to get. I've never met a person that says it's okay just to murder somebody at your discretion. So that's the issue we have to ask. When does this person become a human? When does the unborn child become a full-fledged human being? And one of the things we do have to recognize, the Bible says, does not differentiate between the unborn and the born. But when we get down to where do we draw the line, that's the issue. That's where people are having debates and having conversations about this. And as I think about it, I've read the arguments for this, that, or the other, whichever side it is on. If you draw the line anywhere besides conception, you open yourself up to a lot of negative applications in other areas of life. One of the places, lines people start is viability. We have to draw a line at viability, and that's where it actually becomes a human life. Well, there's a lot of adults. Are they living a viable life? There are a lot of people that don't contribute to society. Do we say that's viable? I mean, is the Down syndrome person viable? Is somebody who's had a lot of health issues and requires a lot of machines or medicine to stay alive, is that person viable? So we can draw a line there. But I know some draw the line at sentience, of having a consciousness of, that's when the unborn child becomes a human being and we can't murder it. Well, does a comatose person have sentience? And somebody can say, they can have potential sentience. Well, so does the unborn child then, right? And if I know I presented these arguments real briefly. If you want to talk to me about it, I'm more than happy to have a conversation with you about these things. What I'm saying is we value life. That is the core principle of what I want to stress today, is we value life. So if you disagree with me on one of those things, please just come talk to me. But don't allow that to ruin the concept of we value life. Don't get caught up in something don't be a grumbler. Don't be a complainer. Just, if you're going to grumble to me. Sorry, I'm coming off hostile. That's not my point. Sorry. I'm going to step back for a moment. I'm going to step back. I'm not going to get offended if you come up to me and tell me why I'm wrong. But I'm not wrong in the fact that life is valuable. And we need to make sure we recognize that life is valuable. And so when we come to the abortion issue, we have these concepts of how people are categorized. There's those who are pro-abortion. And this would be the extreme on one side, in the sense of this person, painting in a broad brushstroke, of course, this person would say abortion should be legal at any time, for whatever reason, no questions asked. That's it. On the extreme other side of things is those that are anti-abortion, and this person says abortion should never be legal, and it should be an abomination, should be thrown out, and this person has sometimes a tendency to forsake other issues for this issue. Most people do not fall into either of those two categories. Most people fall into the categories that are traditionally referred to as pro-choice or pro-life. Those who are pro-choice want abortion to be legal so it can be safe. And there are certain requirements they may or may not allow for it. But in general, there's a lot of people who are pro-choice that want it to be rare. Their purpose is just for it to be legal so it can be safe. Then, on the other side of that, there are those who are pro-life. And pro-life recognizes the value of life and does not want abortion to happen because they value life. And I've heard its phrase, from womb to tomb, or from formation to funeral. And there's hopefully a more holistic approach to valuing life. Because if we're going to be pro-life, then we can't just forget about somebody once they've been born. And if we're going to be pro-life, we can't forget about that pregnant woman who is trying to make a difficult decision in their life. We've got to value the whole life, the whole person. Because it's not about what somebody does or doesn't contribute to society. It's about the fact that each person is created in the image of God. So we can value prosperity, the principle, or the person. And I fear so many times with the abortion issue, we get so caught up in the principle that we forget about the person. We've got to make sure we remember that there are real people involved in these issues. And that if we forsake these people, then we're not valuing the life that Jesus has called us to live. And Jesus calls us to value life. He calls us to show others that they are valuable. And he does that in his interaction with religious leaders with this woman. See, Jesus has stooped down and is drawn in the dust, and they keep demanding an answer. So Jesus stands up and he says, all right, let he who has never sinned cast the first stone. Then he stooped down again and continued drawing in the dust. When the religious leaders, when the accusers heard this, they began to walk away one by one, beginning with the oldest, until only Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. Now, as Jesus is stooping down, drawing in the dust, I've always wondered, what was he drawing? Was he drawing a picture? Was he playing tic-tac-toe against himself? You know, there are a couple of theories that I find provocative, and these are just guesses. One is that Jesus was registering the complaint that the religious leaders had against this woman. He was writing it down. And you know what happens when you write in the dust? You can wipe it away real quickly. Another thought, in a similar line of thought, is the fact of he was writing the sins of the religious leaders down, showing how they were imperfect, how they deserved condemnation. But you know, again, when you write sins in the dust or write anything in the dust, you can wipe it away real quickly. And there's no way we can know what Jesus was writing there, but to me, it's fun to think about that, of what was Jesus doing. But he challenged the religious leaders, the one who's not guilty, the one who's never sinned, to cast the first stone. Jesus does not answer the legal question, whether we're talking about Roman law or the Old Testament law. Jesus does not engage in the legal question. He moves beyond legality. He moves beyond the principle, and he confronts the concept of sin. Too many times we get caught up with the principle and we don't confront the sin. We just condemn the individual because of the sin. But Jesus is confronting the sin. And I find so many times Jesus teaches us how to confront sin. Because in order to confront sin, you need to have empathy for others. You need to show that you care about others. Confronting sin is not about making someone feel bad. It's not about having someone get their just what they deserve. It's not about making yourself feel better. Confronting sin must be about reconciliation. And I know sometimes that's hard. There are deep wounds that you have probably experienced in your life that you can't just go up and kiss and make up. It takes time. It takes energy. It takes years sometimes to get full-fledged reconciliation. So I'm not saying that when somebody hurts you, you need to forget about it right away and move on with life, forgive them and everything. I do think we need to forgive but recognize that reconciliation sometimes takes a while. But at the same time, I realize Jesus forgave me. Jesus forgives me. And Jesus came not so that I would be condemned, but so that I would be saved. In John 3:17, for God did not send his Son to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Jesus confronts sin not so that we would be condemned, but so that we would avoid condemnation, so that we would be reconciled to God, so that we would be saved. That is what Jesus shows us to do when we confront sin. We need to confront it with empathy, because we need to care about the person, because the person has value. No matter what evil they have done, no matter what good they have done, that person has value because they are created in the image of God. The religious leaders didn't like that, so they left. I've always wondered, did any of the religious leaders leave be like, you know what? Touché, Jesus, touché. I doubt it, because whenever you confront someone that you don't really like, you don't leave impressed unless you felt like you won. I think they left mad, angry, frustrated, discouraged, confused. I think that's probably more likely of how they left. But their indignation shows how they view the woman, how they view sin. And I fear too many times the religious leaders represent how followers of Jesus try to confront sin. We try to parade the person out, to humiliate them, to make them feel bad because, they hurt us, or they wronged us, or they made a mistake, and they need to pay for that. And you know what? By rule, maybe they should. By the law, maybe they should. But that's not what Jesus is calling us to do. He's calling us to value the person. Jesus works to love people and not allow people to become things, to become objects, to become means to an end. Jesus says that cannot happen because we value life. Now, as I said earlier, no society allows for murder, for cold blood murder. No society says that's good and no problem with that. And because society has at least some moral barometer to give it guidance. But then we have the concepts of manslaughter or involuntary manslaughter. And they're tragic because the life has lost. Even if it was no fault of an individual, life was lost. And we can think of, maybe you're following the Alec Baldwin situation of how the prop somehow malfunctioned, regardless of is anyone at fault or not. It's tragic. Regardless if somebody did something they shouldn't have done, and I'm not trying to make an accusation, but my point, regardless of the context of what happened, it's tragic because life was lost. We value life because life is created in the image of God, not because of what it can or cannot contribute. Now, the Old Testament, there are times where the Old Testament calls for capital punishment, for the death penalty. The religious leaders alluded to Leviticus chapter 20 when they presented this woman caught in adultery that she should be killed. That's what the Old Testament says. But there's also times in the Bible, including the Old Testament, where those who deserve death by law are spared. I share that today to present the question of, is the death penalty required for society to function? For justice to actually be served, for society to not devolve into anarchy. And that can be a difficult question. Because we look at individuals who have committed certain crimes that by law may warrant the death penalty. And so what do we do? How do we approach that? I know the death penalty is increasingly rare, but just because it's rare doesn't mean that we should ignore the issue. And you can say that, well, someone who has committed these crimes that by law warrant the death penalty or put the death penalty as a possibility, that person has made conscious decisions that someone with a disability cannot make, or someone that the unborn child they did not make. So maybe we're saying, well, we can say it's morally acceptable to do that. But I wonder, how are we valuing life if we say that's okay? How are we valuing life if we say, well, we can kill certain people in certain circumstances? That's something we have to wrestle with, of how do we come to that conclusion? Because I think if we value life, we have to be actively involved in some of the problems that arise and some of the circumstances that increase the possibility that someone might commit crime, whether we're talking about minor or major. Because statistics are clear that they show us that poverty and a poor home life increase the person's chances of committing crime later in life. And it's real easy for someone like me. I grew up in a Christian home. I grew up having anything and everything I needed. If I needed new sneakers, I don't use the word sneakers. If I needed new basketball shoes, I could get my parents could buy me basketball shoes. We weren't rich, but we had everything we needed. And so it's real easy for me to judge someone who grew up in a totally different lifestyle and say, well, that's what they deserve. Now, there are some people who have every opportunity afforded to them and still make terrible choices. And I'm not trying to excuse that, but there are a high majority of people who make poor choices. And they make poor choices. They have to own those choices. But what if followers of Jesus came alongside and said, hey, you're valuable. Let me help. Let me help add meaning to your life. I can't add any value to your life because you are valuable, because you are created in the image of God. And because you're valuable, I'm going to invest in you. What if we took that approach as opposed to just sitting in our comfortable chair judging people or saying, you know what, they get what they deserve, or just being indifferent to those types of things? There's a difference between value and meaning, or difference between value and purpose. Because we value everyone, we are called to add meaning, add purpose to their lives. Now, you can't be all things, all people. That's not my point. But it's to recognize if we value life, because life is created in the image of God, that has implications for us. And some of you may have been burnt and hurt by people doing terrible things. And I'm not trying to excuse them, and Jesus will address that in just a moment. But to recognize we value life. But it also makes me think of the concept of euthanasia. Now, euthanasia is Greek for good death. And we have to be careful here, because there's a fine line that we can draw. Some of you, I know, have worked in the healthcare system, particularly in hospice or palliative care, and in which what happens is we've exhausted all of our resources, and so at this point, you know, it's difficult, it's tough, but we're just going to try to make the person comfortable. But there's a big difference between palliative care and assisted suicide. And society tries to tell us that, well, by allowing for assisted suicide, then we are giving the person control. We're not allowing a terminally ill person to suffer. This way the family doesn't have to see the terminally ill person suffer. Maybe we don't have to accrue so many medical bills because of it, so it's helping both society and the family. And I'm not trying to say we should seek suffering, but I've read stories and heard people talk about how suffering is redemptive, how suffering can be holy, can be sanctifying, can draw us closer to Jesus. And my point is not to say we should seek suffering, but the fact of when we take control of our own lives in such an active way, we squeeze Jesus out. We push him out of our lives. And it's a slippery slope because I believe I came across it. In fact, in the Netherlands, they allow doctors the discretion to end the life of any child under the age of 1 at their discretion. Well, because, they want to make sure they provide dignity to that life. And so if we value all life, regardless of what the life does or does not contribute to society, we have to show it. We can't allow, I'm not saying we need to go and protest in the Netherlands, that's not my point. But the reality is we have to show that life is valuable. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He continues. He's alone in the crowd with the woman. And so he stands up and he says to the woman, "Where are your accusers? Didn't even one condemn you?" And she said, "No, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I. Go and leave your life of sin." Religious leaders left. They didn't stay. Now, Jesus did not say what was required for the woman to receive forgiveness, for her to be acquitted. But he shows that acquittal, forgiveness, redemption is freely given. The religious leaders, again, were using the woman to manipulate their own agenda, to try to trap Jesus, to try to give themselves an edge. But Jesus changed the dialogue to confront sin. But he also shows that the grace that he provides is not a license to sin. He told the woman, he said, "I don't condemn you." And he said, "Go, leave your life of sin. Sin no more." But in this moment, I think the woman was leaving both sin and condemnation. Because just if you say, "Go and sin no more," it's as though she's, okay, go live a morally better life. But she was also leaving the place of condemnation, the place where she felt shame and guilt. And Jesus says, "You don't need to feel that anymore. Leave." He says, "I'm taking that." And to us, he says, "I took that for you." Death was arrested. Shame, guilt was arrested through the suffering of Jesus Christ. And he calls her to embrace a new life. This is where you were. Don't settle for that. Go somewhere else. Leave your life of sin. Forgiveness is granted, but sin is confronted. So as I stand here today saying that we value life, it's not as though we just ignore sin, but we value the person. We don't value prosperity. We don't value the principle. We value the person first. Now, when we value the person, we're going to care about the principle. We're going to care about right and wrong. If I care about somebody, I'm going to help them. And sometimes that means I'm going to say, "Hey, we need to be better. You need to do something different here." And when we do that, when we live the way Jesus calls us to live, prosperity happens. Sometimes worldly wealth happens, but in general, joy, happiness. We got the fruit of the Spirit, right? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, in self-control and faithfulness. But, there's fruit, there's prosperity happens. If we value the person, then the principle, then the prosperity. But too many people value prosperity, the principle, and neglect and reject the person. The last scenario or situation I want to mention today is that of suicide. Again, the society agrees that murder is wrong, but where does suicide fit into all of this? And as I was looking into this, my heart broke on some of the statistics that I found. Because I found that every year 800,000 people die of suicide. That's heartbreaking. But I also read, and this is an estimate, that for every successful suicide attempt, there are 24 unsuccessful suicide attempts. So if you do the math, that's about 20 million suicide attempts a year. That's crazy. And it's heartbreaking. And most people who attempt suicide are not thinking in terms of death. They're thinking in terms of escape, of getting out. And so there's despair that's happening. There's just not knowing how to take the next step. And there's depression. And there's all of these types of things. And one of the things I think we need to recognize is if you're a follower of Jesus, it's okay if you're depressed. Now, I think Jesus can free us from anything that binds us. But if we interact with each other, putting fake smiles on, hiding what's going on in our lives, then I think we miss opportunities to experience the fullness of what Jesus calls the church to be. Now, I'm not saying we need to air our dirty laundry out and all those types of things, but the reality is, whether it's you, whether it's somebody else, if you're depressed, if you're discouraged, if you're in despair, if you don't know how to carry on, your life has value. Not because of what you can or can't do. Not because of the contributions you do or do not make to society. Your life has value because your life is created in the image of God. The people you encounter. You know, I know there's probably a lot of people in your life that frustrate you. But when we recognize that person who frustrates us to no end is valuable because that person created in the image of Jesus, that gives us greater empathy for that person. That gives us greater opportunity to impact that person for Jesus. Not in a way that we're trying to manipulate the individual, but that we just care about the person. You may disagree with some of the issues that I've mentioned today. You may have different conclusions that you think are right. But one thing I will not back down on is the fact that life is valuable because life is created in the image of God. Amen. We have to make sure we start there. If that's not our foundation for judging the value of life, then we have lost. Then we are missing the calling that Jesus has given us. Because when we value life, you know what we do when we encounter people we don't like? When we encounter people that are sinful, when we encounter people that are making improper decisions, you know, when we encounter those people, you know, if we value their life, what we do is whether we do it verbally or whether we do it with our actions, we say, let me tell you about Jesus. Because when we say, let me tell you about Jesus, it breaks down all these barriers. It moves from the legal issue to the sin issue. It doesn't neglect the person. It highlights the person. It values the person and says there's hope, there's purpose, there's meaning. Not because of what you can contribute, but because of the value of being created in the image of God. That's what we're called to do. We need to share people and tell them about my Jesus, not about what's wrong with them, but tell them about what's right with my Jesus. Chris and Becky are going to sing the song, My Jesus, and you may be familiar with it. If you want to sing along, you can. I'm going to say you can stay seated. I think the words will be on the screen. But I think this song speaks to the calling that every follower of Jesus has. That no matter the issue, no matter how frustrated we get with somebody, we value them, and our starting point has to say, here's what's right with my Jesus.